Emergent human rights in the age of revolutions. My name is Noah Gift. Let's talk through some of the emerging human rights from the age of the revolutions, like the French Revolution, and how they apply to some of the issues we have today in the digital world. First up, we have the context for the French Revolution, perhaps the most famous of any revolution that we know about in history. There were systemic issues. These included feudalism, also poverty and hunger, and in addition, random events like droughts and famines, and some of the emerging ideas of democracy as well, including Thomas Paine's common sense. And Thomas Paine himself actually went to France and talked with the revolutionaries and was imprisoned for a little bit. But also the American Revolution itself was a catalyst for some of the ideas. And then these pamphleteers who were mass printing ideas. Some of the ideas were good. Some of them were very poor. They were misogynistic. They were disinformation. But this was the context for the French Revolution. Now, some of the positives of the French Revolution, and there were lots of positives, were that it was a reshaping of the socio-political landscape, and it meant that human rights became more important. And this influenced both democracies in that era and also later democracies, even post-World War II and even today. Some of the examples include the rights of man, and these would be liberty. So you have the right to liberty, you have the right to have your own property, you have the right to be secure. There's also this concept of natural rights, so freedom and ownership and security and resistance to oppression, and also this idea of national authority versus an individual ruler. So a monarchy is an individual ruler, but the nation is a type of authority. And we can see even today, there's some issues here that are similar in the digital world. There were some major limitations, though, for women, for slaves. So it wasn't a utopia. There were some real problems with even their initial rights of man. I mean, the name itself is a dead giveaway. We also have the negatives, mob rule, and also the Napoleonic era. And so with the revolution, some of the violence and irrational behavior was really hurtful to the cause, because innocent people were killed and they suffered. And this misinformation itself that was spread by the pamphlets even caused the people that were spreading the misinformation to eventually become a victim of the revolution. And this political purge that happened, where people constantly were purging each other and killing each other through political violence, really led to a power vacuum where charismatic Napoleon himself came in and stepped in and led a dark period of history afterwards. So there were also some negatives. If we think through the basic fundamentals, though, of what was happening, was the human rights in the feudal era were non-existent because they were built on exploitation and extraction. And some examples of this would be that the population had limited education. They were forced to do labor on that land, so they're tied to the land. Also, there's arbitrary justice. So if somebody that was of a noble class wanted to do something, they pretty much could do it. And there were no concepts of property rights for the majority of people. Now, if we look at what's happening today, there's some of these same components in the digital world. So human rights are non-existent when you have a system that's built on exploitation and extraction, which is a lot of the digital economy we have today. For example, you can't opt out of people scraping your data. There's dark patterns that actually encourage you to have your data scraped or used without your consent. We also have a dystopian labor policy. So these kind of gig economy situations where people don't know how much money they're going to make, or their working wage is much lower than if they just had a regular job. There's also opaque policies. So we don't know what will cause a issue with that platform. And then the data serfdom as well. So just like the peasants in the French Revolution were trapped on a particular section of land, today people are trapped on a platform and their data is kept on that platform. So how do they possibly get out of that? Now, in terms of similar situation as well, we have an intellectual handicap of the population because there is a echo chamber, there's social media addiction, a smartphone addiction, and then there's a substitute of very high quality data sources for clickbait. So instead of reading a book, instead you read a TikTok that's 30 seconds, and it may even be disinformation or misinformation. We also have a business model itself that is designed to profit from the mass surveillance of humans. It's called surveillance capitalism. There's a great book about it that really has described in detail what's happening with surveillance capitalism. But some of the things that have occurred because of surveillance capitalism are that democracy itself is threatened because it's hard to be informed because there's all of these other incentives other than information, right? Addiction, serving out ads, etc. The behavior of humans are modified through nudges. Algorithms are actually in charge versus the nation. So again, if we go back to feudalism, that was one of the problems, was that the sovereignty, right? Is the monarch really in charge, or is the nation in charge? So we have algorithms that are actually ruling versus nations. We also have the asymmetrical power of corporations over the governments and the citizens of a nation as well. So in many cases, a corporation has more power and more reach than the actual government itself. And a lot of this has to do with the way the current legislation is in different regions. And so are we really back to a feudal time? And then we also have the vulnerability to data breaches. So if you're collecting all this data, and even maybe you're not even using the data, eventually some of it could be breached. And then what are the consequences to the people that didn't opt in to this data collection, but now they're going to have real world consequences? There's a need for human digital rights. And the idea here is that humans are more important than corporations or technology. Some of the ideas include that data and intellectual property belongs to the human, and a human must opt into those decisions. Right now, many situations are the opposite, where you have to opt out, or there's a hidden dark pattern where someone doesn't know that their data is being collected and used for some purpose, like training a generative AI model. And also the business model itself that depends on exploitation of humans is defective. That would be kind of a French Revolution view of where we're at currently. And there should be a right to a digital commons. So, blogging and creating art, if it's the incentives are corrupted where people don't want to create art anymore or write things anymore because they're afraid someone will steal it or misuse it, then that's the destruction of the digital commons, and it needs to be protected, just like we protect parks and national parks and community parks. Also, there's a right to not be addicted. If you're a 3-year-old or a 5-year-old or a teenager, you shouldn't have to live in a world where you're addicted to social media, addicted to smartphones. There should be legislation around this where you could design interfaces that are not addictive, where we have the opposite, where we're designing interfaces to be addictive. And we also have the right to live free of algorithmic harm. So if there's disinformation and misinformation happening that creates real world harm, we have the right to live free of those types of algorithmic harm. So there's some substantial issues here with a need for human digital rights, much like some of the ideas that came from the French Revolution. If we look at it, we potentially have regressed all of humanity to a point where we need to really rethink and reframe things so that we have more human rights and we're not essentially feudal citizens in a world where there are arbitrary laws.